When we build, let us think that we build forever. Let it not be for present delight, nor for present use alone. Let it be such work as our descendants will thank us for, and let us think, as we lay stone on stone, that a time is to come when those stones will be held sacred because our hands have touched them. And that men will say, as they look upon the labor and wrought substance of them, "See, this our fathers did for us." John Ruskin, 1849.
A mile east from the heart of the city of Detroit sits an unassuming intersection. Capped to the north by the more active thoroughfare of Gratiot Avenue, and bordered to the east by a 2-mile-long greenway, formerly the rail line for the Grand Trunk Western Railroad. The junction is one of the few remaining artifacts of the Lower East Side's gridded neighborhood, an area developed from French farmland in the decade preceding the Civil War. Over the course of nearly 200 years, the intersection of Jay and Orleans has been traversed by countless horse hooves and wooden wheels, the rubber tires of Model Ts and Cadillacs, and the leather-soled shoes of working-class men, women, and children as they cross through on their way to school, work, market, mass. The work of human hands over many years, the German Catholic Church of St. Joseph still anchors the corner of Jay and Orleans. Her copper-clad spire, ever stretching, ever pointing heavenward, has been attentive observer to the dynamic streets below for over 13 decades. Weathering the many seasons that have come and gone in the great city of Detroit. And within her secure mantle, 150 years' worth of souls have sought and found solace, edification, and sanctification from the sacraments and practices of the Catholic Church.
Detroit Free Press, October 23, 1870. A large procession formed at the corner of Croghan and Antoine Streets and marched to the site of the new Catholic Church edifice, corner of Jay and Orleans Streets, where the ceremony of laying the cornerstone was conducted by Bishop Borges.
After engraving crosses into the rock, the bishop intones a Latin blessing with, "Bless, O Lord, this creature of stone."
America can never forget to acknowledge that they have built the longest canal in the world, in the least time, with the least experience, for the least money, and the greatest public benefit. Jesse Hawley, 1825.
With great fanfare and celebration, the mighty Erie Canal, the product of 7 years of human labor and engineering prowess, is completed and christened. With the opening of the waterway, the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes now meet, and Detroit, Michigan, the city on the strait, sees its first wave of Irish and German migration. The Germans settled on Detroit's east side, in the area now known as Greektown. There, St. Mary's Parish is formed, and for 2 decades serves the area's steady migration of Germans as the sole German Catholic church within the city. By the early 1850s, the Austrian and Hungarian revolutions had spurred an even greater influx of German refugees, most of whom continued to settle along the Fort Gratiot corridor. They lived in simple wooden frame houses and, basking in the freedoms afforded to them in their new homeland, established shops and plied their trades. They ran farms, tanneries, and breweries. They were tailors and teachers and musicians. Many others took work in the sweltering factories of Detroit's burgeoning industries. By the mid-1850s, St. Mary's Church was so overcrowded with German souls that the Bishop of Detroit ordered the founding of a new parish further up Gratiot Road. And in November of 1855, he appointed the Reverend Francis von Kampenhout to lead the young congregation. The parish's patron was to be St. Joseph, foster father of the Christ child, spouse of the Blessed Virgin, and a carpenter, a working-class saint for a working-class people. To aid in the purchase of land and the construction of a new church edifice, Father von Kampenhout sought the assistance of Irish immigrant Daniel Corby, a member of Most Holy Trinity Parish, and a civil engineer known for his generous support of the poor and orphaned of the city. There was not a charitable work commenced in his lifetime, wrote the Michigan Catholic, that he did not aid generously and continuously. In the late autumn of 1855, over an acre of land off Gratiot Road was purchased from parishioner John Grohl. Then, in the depth of a severe winter, construction on the church began with great fervor. And by the following spring, only 6 months after work began, the humble wooden structure was completed. On May 25th, Bishop Frederick Baraga, the storied missionary to the Native Americans of Upper Michigan, and now on the path to sainthood, dedicated Detroit's newest Catholic church. The procession to the new church, wrote the Detroit Catholic Vindicator, was truly gladdening to every Catholic heart and presented one of the most imposing, edifying, and magnificent spectacles ever witnessed in Detroit. The sacramental life of St. Joseph had been well underway before the dedication of the new church, with the parish's first baptism being conferred in a home on February 3, 1856. The child was christened Anton Lingemann, one of 10 children born to Anthony and Dorothea Lingemann of Holthausen, Germany. By the end of that first year, the parish would register 142 more baptisms and nearly 4 dozen marriages. But with this rapid expansion came many growing pains. The survival of several of the early parochial societies was threatened by infighting, and people argued over the direction of the parish itself. And after Father von Kampenhout was transferred in 1859, a rapid turnover of pastors only served to aggravate the dysfunction. In 1860, as the United States itself was on the brink of plunging into a ferocious civil war, Detroit Bishop Peter Paul Lefebvre sent an urgent letter to Prussian priest August T. Durst. Durst was serving as vice president of the newly formed American College of Louvain, a Belgian seminary established to train European priests for missionary service in the United States. Deeply concerned for the future of the young German parish, the bishop requested that Father Durst himself come serve at St. Joseph as quickly as possible. And upon arriving in 1861, he wasted no time in working to bring order to the parish. Within a few weeks, he had arranged for a newly formed order of sisters from Monroe, Michigan, the servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, to take charge of the girls of the parish. The St. Joseph School would be the start of the order's storied presence in the city of Detroit. Its beginning, however, was greatly overshadowed, as on the day of their arrival at St. Joseph, only a few blocks away in Campus Martius, the 1st Michigan Infantry Regiment gathered to begin their long march to the battlefields in the South. For 2 years, Father Durst worked tirelessly to help set the St. Joseph Parish on the correct course. And in 1863, he left for Wisconsin, confident of the parish's future in the capable hands of his younger and very ambitious successor. John Friedland was born in Friedrichsdorf, Germany, May 24, 1833. Ordained a priest in September 1861 after studying at the American College of Louvain, he was sent directly to the United States to begin missionary work. Upon his arrival in Detroit in the spring of 1862, he was immediately assigned to St. Joseph, serving as assistant to Father Durst. In the winter of 1863, the 30-year-old priest was given full responsibility for this flock of over 300 families. Like many of the immigrant priests of his era, Father Friedland was a builder, and he knew there was little better to unite a people than the undertaking of a great project. In 1865, a rectory was built, and the following year, Father Friedland had a gallery installed in the church, which was already proving too small for the growing congregation. By 1867, the children of the parish would be taught in a permanent brick school, whose open 3rd floor would host the grand events of the parish's many societies, which were now beginning to find their stride. His ambitions knowing no bounds, Father Friedland immediately began making preparations for the construction of a larger and grander house of God. The year was 1870. In January, 600 miles from Detroit at New York's East River, work began on a project that would usher in a new era of monumental construction, the Brooklyn Bridge. In July of that year, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, allowing Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck the opportunity to achieve his long-desired goal, the establishment of the German Empire. And on a farm near Oak Grove, Wisconsin, an infant christened Bernard Francis is born. Years later, he would join the Capuchin order at St. Bonaventure Monastery in Detroit, where he would become known to thousands upon thousands of souls nationwide as Father Solanus Casey. In that same year, Father Friedland commissioned New York-based architect Franz Himpler to design the most magnificent structure in the city of Detroit, and Himpler quickly set about the task before him. Though the style was very much out of fashion in 19th century Berlin, Himpler was a master of the Gothic revival and had designed several such churches in his native Germany. For St. Joseph, he would evoke the German Hallenkirche, or Hall Church, resurrecting a medieval style largely ignored for the preceding 400 years, in which the nave and aisles are of near equal height, giving the impression of a single soaring space. Not limiting himself to just the planning of the structure, Himpler also drew the geometric patterns for the edifice's many stained glass windows, marking the first known occurrence of an American architect designing both building and glass. Within a few months, the limestone began to arrive by rail from a quarry downriver. And in August of 1871, they began to build. At a time when even the most skilled craftsmen earned only $1 a day, for the construction of the new edifice, the faithful raised an astounding $250,000.
The New York Freeman's Journal. When we consider that the great majority of St. Joseph's congregation belong to the poorer class, and that hundreds of thousands of dollars are cheerfully donated to the erection of temples to the greater honor and glory of God on every side, we have reason to say, the faith still lives.
There are no pews, and the floors are bare, rough wood. But by the autumn of 1873, the magnificent stone structure is ready for dedication. On Sunday, November 16th, 24 societies of German, French, Polish, and Irish Catholics marched to the city's newest and largest building for the solemn high mass of dedication. And with the support of the Detroit Opera House Orchestra, the sound of Haydn's Heiligmesse echoes off her freshly painted walls and through the souls of the many faithful who have gathered beneath her gable. The internationally renowned mayor of Munich studio had only been crafting stained glass windows for a decade when commissioned by Father Friedland. Working with Himpler's geometric patterns, they crafted the figures and pedestals to fit seamlessly into the German architect's designs. And the studio's work here, the soaring backdrop to the holy sacrifice of the Mass for generations and often regarded as the crown jewel of the structure, is the oldest of its kind known in the United States. Much of the remaining glass in the space was crafted within a few blocks of the new church by the hands of St. Joseph parishioners, the firm of Friedrichs and Staffen. The church was adorned with pieces from the ancestral homes of much of its congregation: Innsbruck, Munich. Other pieces, believed to have once adorned the original church, now assumed into the grand Gothic structure, would continue to serve as an unbroken thread to the founding men, women, and children of 1855, who likewise were provoked to thoughts of higher things at the sight of them. For years thereafter, many hands toiled on the finest details of their contributions. The epistle-side confessional, built in a rustic Gothic style, was crafted by local artisan Anthony Osbold, who carved the piece in a workshop behind his Detroit home. At the time of its completion in 1880, he was only 23 years old. Osbold would go on to achieve great success, creating over 3,000 furnishings for churches across the country, including the 3 altars of Detroit's St. Bonaventure Monastery. A man whose name was for decades spoken alongside those of Edison and Tesla, Charles Van de Poel had had an intense fascination with electricity and its possibilities since childhood. But in deference to the wishes of his carpenter father, he apprenticed as a woodcarver and sculptor in Paris. And over several years he honed the talent that would craft many of St. Joseph's significant wood pieces. He completed the St. Joseph altar in 1875. And later that year, the first electric lamp in Detroit was lit above the Nativity creche at Holy Trinity Church by Mr. Charles Van de Poel himself. He would go on to hold over 240 patents, all related to electric power, including the iconic electric streetcar. Across the church from Van de Poel's St. Joseph altar sits the resplendent altar of the Blessed Virgin, whose pinnacles soar to the heights of the edifice. The piece is adorned with layers of intricate woodwork from foundation to peak, and several statuettes, representations of angels and the parents of the Blessed Virgin, sit in niches at its base. The name of the artisan who crafted it is lost to time. No man knows how many hammer blows sounded out in this space, and how many unsung brush strokes, chisel strikes, and needle stitches ennoble its interior. Countless souls have left their own contributions throughout the decades, to the boon of each successive generation. Others chose a more direct way of echoing their sojourn here, down through the years. This is to say nothing of the innumerable pairs of shuffling feet, which have polished the long aisles with a century and a half of footsteps.
Detroit Free Press. Through the energy of Father Friedland, the handsome stone edifice we now have at the corner of J and Orleans was erected. The church stands as a monument to his efficiency, and he has a live parish supporting him.
Over 3 decades, Father John Friedland led the growth of the St. Joseph Parish from small offshoot sect to the second largest Catholic congregation in the state of Michigan. It was a congregation composed of people from all walks of life: factory workers and firemen, conductors and clerks. There were Detroit aldermen, surgeons, vice presidents of banks, and nationally renowned architects and craftsmen. One seat was occupied weekly by the proprietor of one of the largest coal companies in the city of Detroit. Another by an aged veteran who had fought with Napoleon in his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812, and again at the Battle of Waterloo. They were all here united firmly on 3 things: their devotion to the Catholic faith, their affection for their Prussian pastor, and their great pride in their German heritage. The German Catholic enterprising spirit was such that it led one Irish clergyman to remark, wherever they settled in any numbers, the familiar pattern of church, parish school, parish clubs, and the German language newspaper soon appeared. Like other immigrant communities, the Germans were equally ambitious outside of the parish. Most belonged to labor organizations and social welfare societies. Some sought involvement in city politics, in large part to advance protections for their community from political and workplace discrimination, but in no small measure to guard their German Catholic culture from the onslaught of nativist suspicion. But it was not only the German Catholic culture that the St. Joseph faithful wished to preserve and promote. From the time of its dedication in 1873, the St. Joseph structure was renowned for its acoustics and landed on the forefront of the international Cecilian movement. Their objective was to resurrect the a cappella singing of sacred music during the Mass, principally the work of late Renaissance Italian composers. The St. Joseph Choir was prolific in performances and won several first prizes in competitions around the country. As a ministry, they were likewise as active, giving frequent benefit concerts and bringing sacred music to particularly unsacred places. To complement the many voices of the choir, a massive organ was commissioned by Father Friedland, and the New York firm of J.H. and C.S. Odell completed the instrument in late 1873. Using designs prepared by Franz Himpler, Detroit cabinet maker William Mayer crafted the wooden enclosure. In a grand celebration on May 5, 1874, the organ was dedicated with a concert from several local organists, and the Detroit Free Press's front page declared it to be a superb instrument.
St. Joseph's congregation, having the handsomest church in Michigan, one of the 2 largest organs, a genial pastor, and a good choir, ought certainly to be satisfied. Detroit Free Press, May 6, 1874.
By the early 1880s, the parish was starved for the completion of the tower of their church. By Himpler's designs, it was promised to be the highest point in the city of Detroit when capped with the planned steeple and copper crucifix, and would be an immense point of honor for the young German church. John Peter Schmidt had been a parishioner of St. Joseph for most of a decade when he was called upon to construct the stone bell house. A native of Naunheim, Germany, Schmidt was the young veteran of 2 European wars when he immigrated to Detroit in 1872. In April 1874, John Peter married Maria Turns of Connors Creek. From this happy union would be born 8 children, all baptized at St. Joseph. Under the tutelage of his older brother Gangolf Schmidt, John Peter trained as a carpenter builder, and soon entered professionally into the trade he would ply the rest of his life. The octagonal tower would house the 6 large bells cast by McShane Foundry in Baltimore. John Peter Schmidt and his men completed the tower in 1883. And on Christmas Eve of that year, the blessing of the bells was commenced by Bishop Borges.
When I am drawn, I call to liturgy. Come, I praise the true God. I call the people. I assemble the clergy. I bewail the dead. I disperse storm clouds. I do honor to feasts.
At their tone, the humble frame dwellings and shops that spread out far and wide beneath their mighty perch were emptied, and pews were filled.
From the spire of this church rang its bells for the Angelus thrice daily. They boomed joyously for weddings and happy occasions. They tolled plaintively for funerals and tragedies. Edward A. Skinzel.
In the early 1880s, the scourge of diphtheria haunted the city of Detroit, and many families in the parish saw their young children stricken by it. Among the afflicted were the 4 young daughters of John Peter and Maria Schmidt. At the time, their only children. Mary, the eldest, was 6 years old. Regina was 5. Magdalena was 2, and little Rosa was barely a year old. Over 4 dark weeks in the winter of 1881, all 4 children would pass away. The devastating loss crushed the young parents. They, like so many others over so many years, found solace and strength in their church, where the faithful have confidence that they do not grieve alone. Observing the Friday morning funeral for 5 members of the Rice family, who had perished in a house fire a few blocks from the church in 1891. The Detroit Free Press noted that the weeping of the thousands of mourners who crowded the church seemed to shake the great edifice. George Rice had lived with his family on Orleans Street, above the grocery store he had opened after decades in the tannery business. For many years, the Rices had been greatly respected within the German community. And neighbors would state that they never knew a needy person to be turned away from their grocery store empty-handed.
Detroit Free Press. The manifestations of grief for the departed and the expressions of sympathy for the brothers and sisters remaining were so universal that one could not distinguish a mourning friend from a mere sightseer.
Soon approaching his 30th year of pastorship at St. Joseph, Father Friedland continued to work with unceasing energy for the interests of his congregation. In 1889, he established St. Joseph Commercial College, the all-boys business school with an aim to train young men in typing, bookkeeping, and shorthand. The program was among the first of its kind in Detroit, and immigrant families from across the city sent their boys by foot and streetcar to the corner of J and Orleans, hoping this next generation might have a chance to enter Detroit's burgeoning white-collar job market. The school was to be run by German-speaking members of the French congregation, the Christian Brothers. The brothers, donning their familiar black cassocks and twin-tabbed collars, had first arrived at St. Joseph in 1877, and in short time would make St. Joseph Commercial College one of the finest institutions of education in the whole of Detroit. From its halls began to emerge a number of the city's future judges, leading businessmen, and financial geniuses. Working alongside the brothers, the sisters maintained their charge of the young women and children of the parish, whose numbers were increasing exponentially with each passing year. The spring of 1892 saw the establishment of Detroit's Eastern Market, the great gathering space of farmers and vendors from across southeast Michigan. Every Wednesday and Saturday, grocers, shop owners, and residents from across the city descended upon the bustling German neighborhood to attend the sprawling and lively marketplace. By the following spring, the souls who flocked to the Lower East Side would now shop in the majestic shadow of St. Joseph's long-last completed steeple.
Well might the worthy pastor, Reverend Father Friedland, and his flock rejoice and be proud of the noble edifice, for it is a grand and striking proof of their generosity and of the zealous and self-sacrificing earnestness with which they enter into the cause of God and their holy faith. The New York Freeman's Journal.
By the close of the 19th century, many new societies had been founded at the parish. The Knights of St. John, incorporated in 1886, was structured in the tradition of the medieval European orders and cultivated the virtues of loyalty, faith, honor, and service. The choirs had grown to several dozen voices each, and the many other organizations boasted hundreds of souls in their rosters. The Young Ladies' Sodality alone had 500 members. Like the Sodality, organized in 1863, many of the founding ministries continued to flourish. but none more impressively than the St. Joseph Liebesbund. It was one of the parish's oldest traditions, a mutual aid society founded on a cold evening in December of 1856, and thenceforth dedicated to fraternity, Catholic education, and practicing the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. From its 25 cents a week dues, many of the parish's sick were taken care of, and many grieving families were alleviated of the burden of funeral costs. At no point was the fellowship more prosperous than during the 16 years it was led by John Peter Schmidt. During his tenure, the organization gained nearly 250 new members, and by 1903 was the largest and most prominent Catholic men's society in the state of Michigan.
By his energy, activeness, and sacrifices, he won for the society that high esteem and good standing which it now enjoys. It is to be hoped that the good work of its officers and members will continue, and that St. Joseph's Liebesbund will carry on for many years to come. John N. Jantz.
In the early morning hours of June 4th, 1896, passers-by to 58 Bagley Street, about a mile and a half from St. Joseph, would have been witness to a peculiar sight. Henry Ford, axe in hand, furiously smashing open the brick wall of his rented garage. He had just fired up his first gas-powered car, and it was too big to fit through the door. Hours later, he emerged atop a machine he called the quadricycle. It was the first time a Ford vehicle was driven on the streets of Detroit. That same year, horse-drawn streetcars, a staple of Detroit transportation, were officially replaced by Charles Van de Poel's electric trolleys. A new era was fast approaching in Detroit, with the speed and ferocity of the motors and machines that would catapult it onto the world stage. The days of the sleepy frontier town were nearly lost to memory, and the city on the strait was rapidly being reformed into the engine of the Midwest. So too was 1896, the sunsetting of the old times at St. Joseph. The great growth of the church had birthed several new and large German parishes along the Gratiot corridor, and the newly formed Polish churches of Detroit had been established in part by former members of her flock. The first children baptized at the parish were now grown with adult children of their own, and many founding members were beginning to pass away. In the late hours of February 21st, 1895, Father Friedland finished up a home visit with an ailing parishioner. Making his way back to the rectory on Orland Street, he came upon a patch of ice on the sidewalk, slipped, and fell hard to the ground. The incident seemed innocuous enough, but he soon developed a nagging internal pain. Ignoring this, Father Friedland continued making plans to build, and a new rectory was next on the list. But by the late summer of 1896, as his health began to decline rapidly, it became clear to the good priest that he would not live to rest his weary head in this new home.
The Michigan Catholic. Old and young were to be seen constantly coming and going to his residence, making inquiries about his condition, though it was felt that he would never fully recover his health.
In the evening of September 8th, 1896, at the age of 64, the Reverend John Friedland passed away. A period of public mourning, unlike anything ever seen in the old neighborhood, began the following day.
The Michigan Volksblatt. The German people suffered a great loss in the death of Father Friedland. Truly, Father had inculcated in the parish church and school through many years of effort and worry, a strong bulwark of German Catholicism. To many, however, only the outward activities of his office were known. They did not know of the many tears he checked on the cheeks of the poor, of the many walks he made, not only as spiritual advisor and shepherd of souls, but as a true friend of humanity. He always had a heart full of joy, a hearty humor which, with the freshness of youth and his cheerfulness, was able to find a path to their hearts, and stilled its storms whenever he appeared.
Succeeding Father Friedland was Bernard J. Vermers, a Westphalian native who had previously run St. Boniface Parish on the city's west side to great success. The two priests, born only a few years apart, had both studied at the American College of Louvain. And in short time, Father Vermers showed himself to be filled with the same relentless building spirit that had possessed his predecessor. The rectory was quickly completed, the old one converted to accommodate the sisters, and Father Vermers began the work of a decade and a half, directing the installation of the church's crowning touches. This robust spirit was extolled by Bishop of Detroit John Foley, who declared the parish the pearl of the diocese. At the time of Father Vermers' installation, the parish's German Americans were in their fourth generation. And despite the growing pressure of wholesale assimilation within Detroit's ethnic communities, they remained fervent in the preservation of the church's German character. Speaking at the Silver Jubilee celebration of the church in 1898, a neighboring priest lauded the congregation for upholding their culture. The parish, he claimed, would remain a truly German one. To the many faithful in attendance, this was undoubtedly true, and the evening concluded with a rousing chant, Ein Prosit auf die St. Joseph Gemeinde. Cheers to St. Joseph Parish. In January of 1910, Henry Ford moved production of his increasingly popular motor cars from Piquette Avenue in Detroit to Highland Park, where his company would be better able to meet the high demand for the Model T. Such was the case with many of Detroit's thriving industries. The city was too full, too crammed to accommodate the rapid growth they were experiencing, and so they ventured north, east, and west in search of more space. Many Detroiters likewise dreamt of greener pastures. They had prospered far beyond the wildest dreams of their immigrant forebears and seized the opportunity to leave the frame houses and soot-filled air of the inner city. The German neighborhood was getting old. Having served several generations of families, the simple wood and brick homes and businesses that sat nearly on top of each other were markedly weathered. By the mid-1910s, the St. Joseph Church had fully assumed the ashen topcoat that also covered the residences surrounding her. The formerly sandy white limestone was now marked with black stripes, the result of, among many things, the coal yards that occupied whole blocks on the Lower East Side, and the regular passage of steam locomotives on the adjacent DeQuinder rail line. At regular intervals, the buildings on the St. Joseph campus would tremble fiercely as the large engines roared past on their way to and from the riverfront. The brothers, sisters, and students at the schools on J Street would then scramble to shut the classroom windows lest the spaces be quickly filled with black smoke and soot. While many sought any way possible to leave the old neighborhood, Father Vermers did what he could to stay. He had planned on retiring in 1912 and made arrangements to live in a house constructed on the southern end of the campus. His retirement, however, was short-lived, and in 1915, at the age of 79, Father Vermers passed away. Father Vermers' successor was the Reverend Henry Kaufman, who, in his short pastorate, was known as a good friend of the impoverished and disenfranchised of the neighborhood. He established scholarships aimed at allowing poorer students the opportunity to attend a St. Joseph's school, all of which remained prominent among the urban academies. Under his guidance, the parish's chapter of the St. Vincent de Paul Society was established, providing food, clothing, unemployment assistance, and a number of other services to the families of the Gratiot corridor. And after becoming aware that deaf Catholics in the area had no priest to minister to them, he set about learning American Sign Language. And on October 11, 1914, he offered the first diocesan Mass for the Catholic deaf community. In 1916, after 4 years of dedicated service to St. Joseph, the now Monsignor Henry Kaufman was transferred to St. Mary's Hospital in Detroit, where he would begin a tenure as chaplain that would last over 3 decades. Appointed to replace him at the old German church was a young man already well known to much of the parish. Born on St. Valentine's Day, 1875, Theodore Lindemann was the eldest child of German immigrants, Charles and Susan Lindemann, and received his early education on Detroit's west side at the St. Boniface Parochial School, where he served on the altar under then-pastor Bernard J. Vermers. After earning a degree from the Detroit College in 1896, he entered St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore and was ordained to the priesthood on July 1, 1900, at Saints Peter and Paul Church on Jefferson Avenue. After spending 4 years in Kalamazoo, Bishop Foley brought Father Lindemann back to Detroit, where he was assigned to St. Joseph, serving as assistant pastor to his childhood mentor, Father Vermers. He then labored in Fowler, Michigan for 11 years before returning to the corner of Jay and Orleans, this time assuming the title once held by his childhood priest, albeit in a strikingly different season. St. Joseph had at long last come into its own. The days of building were completed. The societies and schools were fully established. And before Father Lindemann laid the task of maintenance. He was installed as rector on February 5, 1917. 2 months later, on Good Friday, the United States declared war on Germany. The fervor of American patriotism dealt a severe blow to the thousands of German communities across the nation. From Washington, D.C., President Woodrow Wilson spoke disparagingly of what he called hyphenated Americans, questioning their loyalty to the United States and ordering nearly 500,000 people, now labeled as alien enemies, to carry identification papers at all times. Several thousand were sent to internment camps established throughout the country, remaining there for the duration of the war. Paranoia seized the nation from coast to coast, and the suppression of all things German became the order of the day. German homes and businesses were vandalized. German newspapers run out of business, and German books were burned in public displays. In 14 states, the teaching of the German language in schools was outright banned. At St. Joseph, a program was established to greatly reduce the use of German within all of its institutions. Though the war would be over and anti-German fervor diminished by the fall of 1918, it was abundantly clear that the German community's long resistance to complete assimilation was a lost cause. By the 1920s, Detroit was an international boomtown, one of the most exciting and luxurious metropolitans in the world. The old city on the Strait was now the fourth largest in the country, the population ballooning from less than 500,000 in 1910 to over 1.5 million 2 decades later. Enticed by the promise of good factory jobs, immigrants had been pouring into the city in great numbers for the previous 10 years, and the rush showed no sign of slowing down. Many of them settled, willingly or not, in the now less desired homes that surrounded St. Joseph. The Italians, who numbered 900 in the whole city in 1904 and grew to 40,000 in less than 2 decades, quickly became the second largest demographic at the parish. The African-American migrants, who were not only seeking better employment, but also fleeing the increasing assault of Jim Crow laws in the South, were largely Protestant. At the rectory on J Street, Father Lindeman began to sense an undercurrent of change, rapidly swelling up in his church. In 1921, for the first time in its history, the parish recorded fewer than 100 baptisms. By the middle of the decade, that already diminished number would be nearly halved. Families were leaving in great numbers each year to join one of the 100 new parishes established by Bishop Gallagher all across the city. And the once vibrant social life at St. Joseph began to fade. The good pastor understood clearly that his task was no longer of maintenance, but of revival. Under his direction, dwindling societies and clubs were reorganized in an effort to keep them operating, and with the hope of reclaiming the prosperity they had once known. He established a monthly bulletin, which was mailed to registered members of the church, now spread far and wide across the city. This effort, he prayed, would keep alive interest in the parish. And day in and day out, with the same hearty spirit of his predecessors, Father Lindeman served the sacramental needs of his flock, and for his untiring zeal, earned their great devotion. But he was beloved by no one more than the students of the parish schools, for whom he made the special effort to attend their games, plays, and recitals. The crash of 1929 and subsequent depression brought further challenges to the pastor's desk. The parish's chapter of the St. Vincent de Paul Society was overwhelmed with requests for assistance in the neighborhood, which was becoming more destitute with each passing year. The collection baskets less full, the parish struggled to pay for the services of the teaching sisters, and talk of restructuring the schools began to take place. To these challenges, St. Joseph's pastor gave his all. And in June of 1940, while reciting the divine office in the sanctuary of the church, Father Theodore Lindeman quietly passed away.
The world will never know the good Father Lindeman did. He was a very quiet man. He performed his duty and did not speak about it afterwards. His life was marked with the spirit of a true priest. Nothing was too great or too humble. so long as it promoted the honor and glory of God and the Church. The faithful recitation of the divine office, as well as the devout saying of Holy Mass, gave him the necessary strength to carry on till the Master called him to his just reward. Taking the tired spirit of Father Lindemann, the sweet angel brought him to the throne of God, where all pain and work cease. May his soul rest in peace.
Appointed to succeed Father Lindemann was the Reverend Arnold Schneider, who had been associate pastor at the church the preceding year. A short barrel-chested man, Schneider had toured internationally as a champion lightweight boxer before serving in the First World War as an infantryman. Upon his return to the States, he became a football star at Assumption College in Ontario. Admired for both his character and athletic abilities by students and faculty alike, who referred to him affectionately as the big little fella, Schneider's future success as a professional athlete seemed imminent. But at the age of 29, he discerned a call to the priesthood, and in 1928, left for Austria to complete his priestly studies. 4 years later, he was ordained in Innsbruck, celebrating his first solemn high mass in the little German town where his grandparents had been born. Now 46 years old, Father Schneider was tasked with ushering the soon-to-be 100-year-old St. Joseph Parish into a new era. To this end, the church established the weekly novena to St. Joseph, trusting in their patron's guidance during this period of great change, already well underway. The dawning of the Second World War and the parish's continually changing ethnic makeup had brought an end to exclusively German homilies in 1939. Around that same time, President Franklin Roosevelt's federal New Deal programs had begun to render obsolete many of the local mutual aid societies that had bolstered immigrant communities across the country for generations. Among those affected was the St. Joseph Liebesbund, which by the 1940s was a shell of its former self. What was once one of the city's most powerful institutions of charity and fraternity would soon be disbanded. The commercial college remained a strong center of urban education, still attracting pupils from the far reaches of the city. But financial woes continued to plague the St. Joseph Parish. In 1941, the Diocesan School Board declared that the school would be placed exclusively under the care of the brothers. The dire need to maintain a boys' school on the Lower East Side prompted Edward Mooney, Detroit's first archbishop, to allow the school to assume the additional buildings on campus. Both the grade school and the St. Joseph Academy for Girls would be closed. On June 12, 1942, the good sisters left the St. Joseph Parish after 81 years of service.
Nothing is so inevitable in this world as the certainty of change. In the realm of nature, in the intellectual and spiritual life of man, any attentive observer can perceive that the whole world is moving to some goal. Dear classmates, we have come to the end of the happy road which we have traveled together for so long. Would that we could go on together, down the long trail of life, to the very end. To our dear alma mater, scene of our joys, our sorrows, our triumphs, within whose sheltered walls we have spent so many happy hours. We must say goodbye. But what loving memories around you cling? What sweet associations bind you to our hearts? Saint Joseph, symbol of our happiest years. We leave you now in reality, but not in spirit. Farewell. Corinne M. DeLevy.
In the early 1920s, one of Detroit's first major urban planning projects had taken place alongside the St. Joseph campus, in which a mile of vital and busy rail line was lowered 25 feet below street level to accommodate increasing automobile traffic and put an end to fatal collisions. The project was a mammoth and costly undertaking, and over 5 years, dozens of homes and businesses along DeQuinder Road were demolished to accommodate the 4-lane rail line. To help remedy the great chasm that now ran through the east side of the old neighborhood, road bridges were constructed over the cut, consolidating much of the foot and vehicular traffic in the area to around a dozen crossings. Among the crossings was the J Street Bridge, which throughout the 1930s and 40s greatly increased pedestrian traffic in front of the old German church as people made their way downtown and to the Eastern Market. Father Schneider seized the opportunity to connect with the old neighborhood's new communities. Only a handful of residents in the area currently belong to the St. Joseph Parish, which was now a small congregation of fewer than 130 families. He began offering weekly classes for prospective converts, advertised by a billboard erected in front of the church. As a result of the program, several African American families, formerly Protestant, were brought into the Catholic faith. Across the street at 1833 J, the school complex was now known as St. Joseph High School of the Christian Brothers, and the vast majority of its student body belonged to neighboring parishes. The long tradition of St. Joseph as a commercial school was maintained in the curriculum. But the unifying element of the school's academic program was its religious studies, which, in addition to courses in theology and philosophy, offered the students weekly confession and spiritual direction. Though no longer a parish institution, the school and the church remained deeply connected. The regular schedule of the students included a great many religious activities, spiritual retreats, monthly novenas, and frequent benediction, for which the parish offered the use of the grand Gothic church. In turn, the school supplied the church with many of her much-needed altar boys. Another storied tradition maintained from the days of the commercial college was the school's prominence in urban athletics, both parochial and secular. Within a few years of reorganizing, the school's basketball team was first among its many Catholic school rivals and faced Detroit's Miller High School in the inaugural contest for the title of City Champion. The game was played at Olympia Stadium in front of a crowd of over 16,000 excited Detroiters. Post-war prosperity and the promise of federal dollars toward aggressive slum clearance and urban renewal programs ignited a fury of redevelopment in America's major cities. The city of Detroit had been a national frontrunner in such projects, and in the early 40s had constructed what is believed to be the first urban freeway in the country. Now, at the dawn of the second half of the 20th century, the city had selected several neighborhoods for redevelopment. First among them was the severely blighted neighborhood that bordered the St. Joseph Church. The area had become detrimentally overpopulated following the manufacturing boom brought on by the Second World War, and remained that way due to restrictive housing covenants, which prevented its largely African-American population from living in most other parts of the city. Exorbitant rent costs pressured multiple families to cram into single homes, many of which lacked indoor plumbing and electricity. The condemnation of property began in 1950, and many residents of the area were given only a few weeks and little assistance to find new housing in other parts of the city. Within a year, the bulldozers arrived.
Even today, our forefathers would be able to recognize the beautiful Gothic edifice, which they built in 1873. But the change from tree-shaded suburban area would make them heartsick. Father Arnold Schneider.
Over 3 years, nearly 60 acres of homes and businesses, some of the earliest remnants of those first German settlers, were razed.
Perhaps you're saying to yourself, my parents moved away from St. Joseph's Parish years ago. Why come to me now for help? 53 acres of vacant land, on which formerly stood the homes of our parishioners, tell part of the story. To whom can we turn but to our former parishioners and friends of St. Joe's?
Even as his flock arrived at their church amid an endless sea of vacant lots, Father Schneider held out hope that resurrection would soon come. And he was more determined than ever before to have the church in fine condition by the parish's 100th anniversary. To that end, he launched an ambitious fundraising campaign, and artisans were commissioned to restore and embellish many of the church's oldest artifacts. Then, in September 1956, a great array of Detroit's clergy and faithful descended upon the corner of J and Orleans. The Cardinal of Detroit, Edward Mooney, St. Joseph's own Monsignor Henry Kaufman, and sons of the parish, Father Anthony Kaufman and Father Richard Dorr. The mighty bells of St. Joseph rang out above the large crowds as they filled the church building. 100 years had come.
Just about everybody returned on Sunday, September 30th, to St. Joseph's Church for the 100th birthday. It's been a long time since 1,800 persons last crowded within its stately walks for any celebration. His Eminence said he hoped that the new life that entered the cleared area would bring a new hope to the old parish, and eventually raise her to the proud stature she once held among the parishes of Detroit.
Before a single structure had been condemned and vacated, the architects of the Gratiot redevelopment project had bet on there being a great demand from private contractors for the soon-to-be cleared land. In July of 1952, 43 vacant acres were officially opened for bids at an auction in City Hall. 30 people attended. Not a single bid was made. And for several years after, not one developer showed any interest. The area, only a few blocks from the heart of the city, began to be reclaimed by nature, sparking the sardonic nicknames Ragweed Acres and the Gratiot Jungle. While there was little happening around the church, the parish itself was undergoing much change. Exactly 100 years after their forebears had endured the same, the faithful entered a period of rapid clerical turnover. In December 1956, beloved Father Schneider was transferred to Detroit's Annunciation Parish. and replaced at St. Joseph by the Reverend Jerome Krieg, who shepherded the church until 1958, when Father Charles Krause was assigned to the parish. In 1961, Father Leo Trees, the nationally celebrated author and columnist, was made pastor, but was then transferred to Bloomfield Hills within a year. But following Father Trees was a man who, unbeknownst to any at the time, would become one of the parish's longest-serving pastors, and like his predecessors would dutifully guide the parish through many turbulent decades. Thomas Bresnahan was born in 1914, one of 8 children of a prominent downriver family whose father had served as Cass County prosecutor and mayor of River Rouge. The path to the priesthood began early for Bresnahan. He entered Sacred Heart Seminary High School as a sophomore in the late 1920s, and in 1940, at the age of 26, received holy orders. Though a quiet and reserved man by nature, Bresnahan established the Gabriel Richard Institute, an international organization dedicated to teaching confidence and leadership skills, with an aim to return Christian virtue to an increasingly secular culture. When he arrived at the parish in 1962, the city's push to modernize its buildings had caught up with the St. Joseph School, now a nearly 100-year-old building. Constructed only 2 years after the Civil War, the facility lacked many of the structural standards required by modern building code. Valiant efforts were made by the active St. Joseph Alumni Association to raise money for renovation, and some rejuvenation took place. But by 1963, the Christian Brothers had come to what many now understood to be an inevitable decision.
It is painful to be the last principal, but the building is tired. The cost of rebuilding would be staggering. Education is like life. It has to go on. It is not easy, but it is time.
Brother Matthew Maloney, FSC.
We would like to sum up our class history with the immortal Veni, Vidi, Vici. However, this is impossible. I'm afraid we came, we saw, but were conquered. And lucky for us, we surrendered our youth and put on our manhood when confronted with the formidable Spirit of Christ, manifested in the teaching and preaching, the friendliness and discipline of the brothers. 4 years of the Spirit of Christ, manifested in the classroom, on the sports field, in extracurriculars, at social gatherings, seem to have been the instrument of our happy loss of immaturity and the root cause of the maturity we possess. We can only hope that what we have we may not lose, but rather hold on to, augment, and cherish as the heritage of Brothers Boys.
The great J Street campus, the original school, the old commercial college building, and the Christian Brothers house were sold back to the Archdiocese. When none at the Chancery nor the St. Joseph Parish could find their own solution to the problem of the aging buildings, the decision was made to demolish. And in August 1964, the church lost her decades-long companions. By the early 1960s, development in the Gratiot corridor had finally begun. And though the formerly vacant land was now being repopulated, the St. Joseph Parish rolls remained stagnant. The church had fewer than 100 members when Father Bresnahan arrived in 1962. But he, with a cheery spirit, continued to reach out to the souls who began to fill the apartments and townhouses in the newly dubbed Lafayette Park. In the decade prior, the parish had purchased the vacant lot behind the church in anticipation of needing space for an elementary school once the neighborhood had been rebuilt. Now, with all of the parish schools gone, Father Bresnahan began to gauge the need for a parochial school for the area's new residents. The developers of the Lafayette Park complexes believed there would be a great demand for a new private school. But as the years went on, little interest was shown, and the St. Joseph Parish remained the church alone. Undaunted by the setbacks, Father Bresnahan and the faithful began working to have the old church in excellent condition for its upcoming centennial. In November of 1970, a high wind ripped off shingles and copper from the mighty 200-foot tower. The parish commissioned Jerry and Beverly O'Neill, a husband-wife team of steeplejacks, to make the repairs. When you find a man who's skilled in slate, copper, gold leaf, and he's a steeplejack besides, Father Bresnahan remarked, well, they're just hard to find. That's why we settled on O'Neill. Among the more urgent repairs needed was the restoration of the mighty Odell organ, which had deteriorated to the point of being unusable. One of St. Joseph's faithful, 30-year-old William Warden, was tasked with rebuilding the massive instrument with new parts and maintaining the decorative case and as many of the original wooden pipes as possible. In the spring of 1972, an order was placed with a German firm, and the formidable task of disassembling, salvaging, and rebuilding using the original stop list began. A small electric organ was used in the interim, and the grand music program continued at St. Joseph. To mark their patron's feast in 1973, a large celebration was planned, and a Mozart Mass was arranged to be performed. But within hours of the scheduled start of Mass, a large snowstorm prevented the organist from reaching the church. Scrambling to find a replacement, the parish reached out to a young virtuoso named Thomas Curas. Thomas Martin Curas was born on December 21, 1950. The youngest of four, Curas endured a difficult childhood and found solace in music, teaching himself the piano and training on the organ as a young child. He excelled in both and was named organist at St. Alphonsus in Dearborn at the age of 12. Throughout high school, he attended the Palestrina Institute of Detroit, where students were taught, among other things, organ, chant, music theory, and composition. At the age of 20, after passing with unbelievable marks the rigorous two-day examination, Curas became the youngest fellow of the American Guild of Organists, and now served as the full-time music director at Detroit's Cathedral of the Most Blessed Sacrament. It was around that time that he received the desperate call from the St. Joseph Parish on that snowy March evening. Making his way to the church, he arrived just after the Kyrie, and soon discovered that the continuo realization for the organ was with the snowed-in organist. Using only the vocal score of the grand Mozart piece as a guide, Curas proceeded to improvise the remainder of the Mass. The display of talent so impressed both clergy and faithful alike that Curis was offered the position of permanent organist at St. Joseph, a role he accepted and would commence in January of 1974. The remainder of 1973 was a flurry of activity as the parish prepared for the centennial. Over 700 individuals, families, and organizations contributed tens of thousands of dollars toward the church's restoration. William Warden, alongside parishioner Paul Heil, had been working for many months preparing briefs for historical designation, and the church had been officially recognized by city and state registers in 1972. And in early 1973, St. Joseph was added to the National Register of Historic Places. For the design and age of its Mayor of Munich stained glass windows, the church was recognized as being of national importance, the only church in the Detroit area with such a distinction. Then, at long last, in November of that year, the parish marked 100 years of sacraments, service, and sodality beneath the mighty gable of the old St. Joseph Church. Each Sunday that month was dedicated to the significant milestone, with a massive celebration led by Cardinal John Dearden commencing the festivities. Returning to the parish to concelebrate were Father Charles Krause and dear Father Schneider. Monsignor Charles J. Malloy, who had lived in residence at the parish for over 2 decades, gave the homily.
Today, there is much questioning about the building of monuments. However, we must never forget, as the pioneers in this parish never forgot, that whatever we have belongs to God, and this building has stood for 100 years as a witness to that belief. It would take millions to replace this building today, made of brick and stone and wood, put together with loving care by loving hands. The spiritual bank which was established here cannot be estimated. The priests and religious who found their inspiration in this house of God, the fathers and mothers who caught something of the beauty of the Lord in the awesomeness of his home, the children who knelt wide-eyed in the well-worn pews, all this helped them to be better Catholics in a world forever going mad. This church has been honored by our nation, our state, and our city. But what is most important, God has honored it with his Eucharistic presence for 5 generations. It is truly a place which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it.
The decline of Detroit, which had been set in motion decades before, accelerated through the 1970s and 80s. Racial tension and riots in the 1940s had exacerbated the move out of the inner city that had begun around the First World War. And the new highway systems of the late 50s, some of which had been constructed through the main thoroughfares of active, albeit destitute, communities, had been expected to give suburbanites a means to return to the city. But the hemorrhaging of the urban middle-class population only increased, and the new 3-lane expressways now served instead as an escape route. Then, in 1967, came the most devastating and bloodiest of the over 150 riots that took place nationwide that summer. Over the course of 5 days, 43 people died, and more than 400 homes and businesses were destroyed. The second half of 1967 saw the previous year's outward migration to the suburbs more than triple. By the 1980s, much of the city's industry had also left for the suburbs and neighboring states. And the great factory buildings of the boomtown days, the lifeblood of the neighborhoods they anchored, were abandoned and silent. And soon after, in the very heart of the city itself, many magnificent edifices, which had once been the multi-storied markers of Detroit's opulence and culture, were vacant and boarded up. But a mile up Gratiot Avenue, one of the city's oldest beacons of hope and magnificence remained. And souls continued to flock to the corner of J and Orleans for a taste of the sacred among so much desolation and decay. And, in no small part, to find sanctuary from the tumultuous changes occurring within the Catholic Church herself. On December 8, 1965, the Second Vatican Council was closed in Rome by Pope Paul VI, marking the end of a years-long process which had aimed to bring about a new springtime in the Church. The Council had issued 16 magisterial documents proposing momentous developments within the Church's liturgy and practices. Not long after their promulgation, countless priests and religious worldwide, caught up by the social change of the 1960s, began using the documents to justify wholesale overhauls of both liturgical and devotional practices, and of the church buildings themselves. As a result, many storied edifices were stripped of their statues and ornamentation. High altars and communion rails were removed, whole sanctuary and nave layouts rearranged, and sacred music programs were exchanged for modern alternatives. Many faithful embraced the sweeping changes. Others resisted. But in this era of liturgical experimentation, Father Bresnahan, with the support of his flock, remained steadfast to the traditions of the Church and to the rubrics of the Mass. The liturgy continued to be offered in Latin and German. Both the high altar and communion rail remained where they had been placed so many years before. Benediction was offered weekly with a liberal use of incense. A full crew of altar servers was meticulously trained to reverently assist at the holy sacrifice. And the musical heritage of the Catholic Church was not only sustained, but flourished. The centennial year of 1973 had concluded with the dedication of the new organ, and a classical concert performed by world-renowned virtuoso Marie-Claire Alain, heralding another century of St. Joseph as a center for sacred music in the Midwest. Under the leadership of Thomas Curas, the parish's music program retained the pride of place of Gregorian and Ambrosian chant and sacred polyphony. Orchestral masses continued to be organized for Christmas, Easter, and other great feasts. And in 1985, Curas founded what quickly became one of the Church's most indispensable ministries, as the faithful of St. Joseph worked to maintain the great patrimony of the Catholic Church in Detroit. 4,600 miles away from the corner of J and Orleans, a young French priest was also laboring to preserve these same traditions. Ordained by Pope John Paul II in 1979, Father Gilles Vac began his priestly vocation working in Rome. where, under the tutelage of the famed Cardinal Giuseppe Siri and other Orthodox clerics, he cultivated a deep love for the great tradition of the Catholic Church. On account of his great zeal, he was approached by young men seeking a traditional formation to the priesthood. And Vach, equally impressed by their fervor, started working to find a way to bring them all together. In 1988, at the urging of several Roman cardinals, he and Father Felipe Mora formed a religious community and began the search for a bishop willing to invite them to his diocese and grant their fraternity official canonical status. But finding a bishop willing to host them proved to be a great challenge. The zeitgeist of Europe remained firmly uninterested in the pre-conciliar traditions of the Church, and Father Vach and his men found no home there. But providentially, while attending a meeting in Paris, Vach was introduced to Bishop Cyriac Obamba of Gabon, Africa. The good bishop, eager for zealous missionaries to attend to his flock, extended an invitation to Vach's community to minister in his diocese. The young men wasted no time serving both the sacramental and temporal needs of the country's large Catholic population. The community offered the Gabonese the traditional Latin Mass, a full sacramental life in the old rite, and oversaw the construction of church and school facilities. In 1990, Bishop Obamba granted them official standing, and the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest was born.
In the 12 years since the celebration of the centennial of the church building, we have not had the financial ability to do preventative maintenance and make the repairs that a century-old church demands. We've patched and mended and repaired, but surface fixing just won't do it anymore. Once again, we turn to our friends and parishioners, all those who love St. Joseph's, and want to see it continue its unique apostolate for future generations. St. Joseph has meant a great deal to you and me, to our parents and our grandparents. The parish has survived a great many crises over the past 128 years, and this is one more big one. May God bless you. Father Thomas J. Bresnahan.
In the late 1980s, the Archdiocese of Detroit, plagued by the continuing hollowing out of the urban Catholic population and a dire shortage of priests, was faced with a dreadful decision. Many of the parishes selected had seen their congregations decrease from several thousand to a little over 100, and many of them had lost their schools in the preceding decade. The loss of the parish school, one pastor noted, was like firing the starting gun for the race to the suburbs. But to those willing to suffer the dire straits of their parish, for the sake of the community it afforded them, the news was utterly devastating. Despite the best efforts of former pastors, longtime parishioners, and Detroit historians, many of these historic buildings were sold. Among them was St. Joseph's sister parish, St. Boniface, where Father Vermers had served, and Father Lindemann had been formed. Despite lacking a school and even a parish gathering space, St. Joseph had averted closure. But the threat hung over the limestone edifice. and sat heavy in the hearts of her small congregation. Amid these concerns, Father Bresnahan continued to serve his flock with zeal, nourishing their spirits with reverent liturgies, a full sacramental life, and the slow but sure restoration and maintenance of the church. But as he was soon to be in his 80s, the congregation was acutely aware that the day was growing closer when the beloved priest from downriver would no longer be their pastor. And in June 1995, that day arrived. Father Bresnahan had served the faithful of St. Joseph for 33 years. Only the storied Reverend Father Friedland could boast as many years at the old parish. Appointed to succeed Father Bresnahan was Monsignor John Schweder, a Detroit native who, since his ordination in 1960, had earned a reputation for being an adept administrator with impeccable foresight. Whatever parish he was at, one priest recalled, he took it on as a challenge. There he was, grinding away, saying, "This is where God wants me to be." And now before the Monsignor lay one of his greatest challenges. An old inner-city parish from the frontier days, long bereft of its brimming neighborhood, greatly depleted of its historical ethnic base, and an irreplaceable church building growing tired with age. Monsignor Schweder steeled himself, and with the same thriftiness he'd employed to salvage other parishes around the city, he set about cutting every unnecessary cost he could find. And he embarked on a clandestine crusade to secure the future of the parish within the archdiocese. The congregation entered the latter years of the 20th century much in the same way their forebears had the 19th, working fervently to beautify their beloved church. Among the new endeavors was a major campaign to restore each of the building's many stained glass windows, which, after enduring over a century of high winds, freezing cold, and oppressive humidity, were at risk of slipping from their frames and shattering on the floor below. As the faithful of the 1890s had suffered the sudden passing of Father Friedland, so too was the congregation of the 1990s struck with a great tragedy. In July of 1997, after enduring a long battle with cancer, one of Detroit's most prolific musical talents, Thomas Curis, quietly passed away. He was only 46 years old. For years, he had worked zealously to resurrect the largely neglected compositions of forgotten masters and introduce them to a public starved for glimpses of the true, good, and beautiful. And, as a part of the great tradition of composers of sacred music, he left behind an immense library of his own, filled with original hymns, preludes, and organ music. For over 2 decades, many of these pieces had served to attune the faithful of St. Joseph, week after week, to the reality of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. He knew what gifts he had, said William Warden, who had been close friends with Curis for over 25 years. He was pleased with it, and he was thankful for it. Once in a great while, he'd give you a little sideways glance when he'd done something truly astounding at the keyboard, and give you a sly little grin and say, "It just happens," and it was true. What is work for the rest of the world just happened for him. As a new century dawned, the second one witnessed by the old German church, Monsignor Schweder continued his work to keep the doors of St. Joseph open. Since the demolition of the school nearly 40 years prior, the congregation had had no place to gather together and often held events at the nearby Trinity Lutheran Hall or beneath tents in the rectory yard. Monsignor Schweder began working to remedy this problem, both for the benefit of the faithful to have a space of their own year-round, and to signal to the outside world that the old parish was still very much alive. Plans were made to construct a social hall across from the rectory. But to offset the cost of the new construction, a painful decision had to be made. The rectory building of 1865, which had at one point or another been home to parish priests, the servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the Christian Brothers, was unsuitable for regular parish use and incurred immense costs for its upkeep. And so it was decided that the building would need to be sold. After years of navigating bureaucratic roadblocks and red tape, the new hall was finally built. For the first time in decades, the St. Joseph Parish family gathered and broke bread together in a space of their own. A mile and a half north of St. Joseph sits Canfield Street, sometimes referred to as the Avenue of the Cathedrals, on account of the four majestic edifices that sit in a mile-long row: the German Church of St. Elizabeth and three Polish churches, St. Albertus, Sweetest Heart of Mary, and St. Josaphat. All four find their origins in the overflowing congregations of St. Joseph, and, like the old German church, all had suffered the loss of their schools and their neighborhoods in the second half of the 20th century. In 2003, in an effort to keep two of the four churches open, Sweetest Heart of Mary and St. Josaphat were clustered under the leadership of one priest, Father Mark Borkowski. And following the retirement of Monsignor Schweder in May 2004, St. Joseph was added to the cluster as well. While the parish retained its unique identity, the move stirred concern for the future of the church, which for the first time in the congregation's 150 years would be without a full-time pastor. But Father Borkowski quickly showed himself to be dedicated to his new charge. And the hearty band of faithful souls continued to work hard for their church. They established the Choir Fest, an effort to raise funds for the grand orchestral masses and preserve the storied St. Joseph music program. This festival eventually became the parish's Oktoberfest, a yearly celebration of its German heritage. But in speaking with a longtime parishioner years prior, Monsignor Schweder had posited that the future of the old parish did not lie in its historic German connection, which was fading with each passing year. If the parish were to survive, he believed, it would be because of something much more enduring. Since the 1969 promulgation of the new missal following the Second Vatican Council, the traditional Latin Mass, with few exceptions, had been abrogated worldwide. But countless clerics and faithful expressed their desire for the offering of this ancient rite in diocesan parishes. And in 1984, Pope John Paul II authorized a global indult, which granted bishops the authority to permit the offering of the Old Latin Mass when requested. Several dedicated souls in the Archdiocese of Detroit, including more than a few parishioners of St. Joseph, began petitioning the Chancery to have a Latin Mass in the old rite offered in a diocesan parish. For nearly 2 decades, their petitions were unsuccessful. But at long last, in 2004, after decades of patient prayer, the Cardinal Archbishop of Detroit permitted a single Latin Mass to be offered at St. Josephat. 3 years later, Pope Benedict XVI's apostolic letter Summorum Pontificum granted permission to all priests of the Latin Church to freely celebrate the Old Mass. Father Borkowski seized the opportunity, making St. Joseph the first parish in the Archdiocese to announce and schedule a regular traditional Latin Mass. And souls both curious and familiar began to occupy the pews every 4th Sunday at noon. The first decade of the new millennium had been ruinous for Detroit, and the troubles that had plagued the city for the preceding 4 decades became increasingly more dire. Over those 10 years, a quarter of the city's population left. Nearly 1 person every 22 minutes. Unemployment within the city had also been steadily rising, reaching nearly 25% by 2009. And foreclosures left whole streets of old Detroit homes abandoned and vulnerable to arson. The city, once known nationally as the Paris of the Midwest, had become shorthand for urban decay and crime. The automotive industry, almost singularly responsible for Detroit's meteoric rise, had likewise largely precipitated its decline. The industry had been on shaky ground for years, and following the global recession of 2008, 2 of the big 3 faced imminent bankruptcy. As General Motors goes, the old axiom declared, so goes the nation. And within a few years, so went Detroit. In July of 2013, only 2 weeks before the city of Detroit filed for bankruptcy, the cluster of St. Joseph, Sweetest Heart of Mary, and St. Josephat was merged into a single parish. Heading the new Mother of Divine Mercy parish was the Reverend Father Greg Tokarski, a native of Poland who in years past had celebrated masses in Latin, English, and German at the various parish churches. The weight of 3 congregations now on his shoulders, Father Tokarski wasted no time working to sustain the sacramental life of the new parish, and his charisms began to attract new faces to the old churches. But the problem of the aging buildings was quick to resurface. Shortly following the merger, it was determined that the twin steeples of Sweetest Heart of Mary had been severely damaged by years of erosion and wear, and would require significant repairs. But their plans were abruptly halted as St. Josephat's steeple, which for decades had served as sentinel to downtown Detroit, was nearly toppled by a fierce windstorm. As slate shingles continued falling to the street below, the church was temporarily closed, and the threat of losing the iconic steeple loomed large in the parish. The church remained shuttered for nearly a year as the faithful launched a massive fundraising campaign, and in September 2014, the steeple was secured, and St. Josephat was at long last reopened. The souls of the parish could finally breathe a sigh of relief and refocus their efforts on repairs at Sweetest Heart of Mary. But year after year, inclement weather continued to assault Detroit's oldest edifices, and less than 2 years after the parish had paid dearly to save St. Josephat, a ferocious storm ripped through the Gratiot corridor in February 2016. The mighty St. Joseph steeple of 1892 was battered by the unrelenting winds, and large pieces of slate began raining down on the sidewalk below. The corner of J and Orleans was roped off, and for the first time in its history, the old St. Joseph Church was closed to the faithful. While the parish began working immediately to secure the steeple, and the church was reopened within a few months, the damage had struck at the fear that had haunted the small congregation for so many decades. The same fear that had laid heavy on the heart of Father Lindemann as his parish emptied out. On the heart of Father Schneider as the old neighborhood was razed and the land sat vacant for years. And on the heart of Father Bresnahan as the schools were shuttered and demolished, and the repairs the church so desperately needed continued to mount. To the faithful remnant of St. Joseph, what little hope they had of saving their beloved church seemed to diminish with each passing day. So they came and they prayed. Over 10 years prior, 2,000 miles from the parish in Oakland, California, Bishop Allen Vigneron, a son of Detroit, extended an invitation to the canons of the Institute of Christ the King to assist at St. Margaret Mary Parish, which had offered the traditional Latin Mass since the late 1980s. The Institute had long been established in Wisconsin, but with the opening of the ministry in Oakland, a new parish in St. Louis, and the founding of a national headquarters in Chicago, the order was rapidly expanding across the country. By 2009, Bishop Vigneron had returned to Detroit to serve as the city's first native-born archbishop. And in 2016, he once again reached out to the Institute to come minister in his diocese. In addition to their offering of the traditional Latin Mass and a full sacramental life in the old rite, the Institute had come to be known for their work in resurrecting historic city churches and for breathing new life into the old neighborhoods many of these edifices had once anchored. Their restoration efforts had seen much success in Chicago and St. Louis, and now they were faced with their newest assignment: a full revitalization of Detroit's old St. Joseph Church. In early October of 2016, Canon Michael Stein and Deacon Jonathan Fehrenbacher arrived at the corner of J and Orleans to assume operation of the church. With the arrival of the Institute, the hard work of restoration commenced immediately, and old and new parishioners alike offered their time and talent to the repair of the church and rectory. The campus that had so often been empty was now constantly brimming with activity. And the church's long-standing societies and charities, which had survived many hard decades, were reinvigorated. And within a year, Canon Stein announced the launch of the most significant fundraising effort since the 1870s. "We will be working together," Stein remarked, "so this timeless beauty continues to shine as a beacon of hope. This parish community is an active part of the Detroit Renaissance." By this time, downtown Detroit had begun to see much investment pour into the core of the city, prompting many across the nation to admit that it appeared the Motor City was roaring back to life. While countless great edifices of the old days had been lost to time and the wrecking ball, a great many which remained had been restored. And once again, the people of the city could enjoy their magnificence. And a mile up Gratiot Avenue, the imposing steeple of St. Joseph, once the tallest point in the city of Detroit, likewise remained standing, stately and proud. Facilitating the restoration was Detroit Cornice and Slate, the very same institution that had originally embellished the steeple in 1892. With this most prominent work of preservation underway, the restoration of the campus commenced with great vigor, as Canon Stein and Canon Jean-Baptiste Cummins after him oversaw the repair of the church's old limestone walls, the priceless artifacts of Charles Van de Pol and Anthony Osbold, John Peter Schmidt's grand bell tower, and the handiwork of a century and a half's worth of craftsmen. In 2021, one of the most striking restorations took place, as over a century's worth of ash and soot, the remnants of the old steam engines that had rumbled past since the pioneer days, was washed away. And 3 years later, the plot of land across the DeQuinder Cut, where once stood the homes and businesses of St. Joseph's devoted souls, was purchased by the Institute, and grand plans were made to construct school buildings and social spaces for the faithful and the community. The old edifice appeared once more as it had in the days of Father Friedland, and the old German grounds were again filled with his building spirit. A new season had come to the corner of Jay and Orleans.
Edward A. Skinzel, May 1956. This church became their center, their place of devotion, the scene of their weddings and christenings, the staging for the last solemn partings with their dead. There they were baptized, educated, married, and buried. There their children, even their children's children, were baptized, married, and buried. There they laughed and they cried. They fought in dissension and they worked in unity. There boy met girl. The culture and tradition and language and faith were handed down to the fruit of this love. This is the church that has been witness to the prayers and hymns of a faithful people. Years of life have taken their toll, but the Catholic Church is ageless and eternal. And it seems that old St. Joseph's still has its role to play. Once more, the bells will ring triumphantly, joyously, and hopefully, for another century of service to the Church and to Detroit has begun.